The road to Hollow Grove was narrow and winding, barely more than a dirt path cutting through the dense forest. Anna's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as she navigated the sharp turns. The forest pressed in on both sides, the trees towering like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dark canopy. It was early evening, but the thick foliage blotted out most of the daylight, casting long shadows across the path. Her heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and dread. It had been years since she'd last been here, since the accident that took her parents and shattered her childhood. She had just been 8 years old when the car veered off the road and into the abyss below. Anna was the only survivor. Now, 20 years later, she had returned to the place that haunted her dreams, a place she had sworn never to see again. But the letter had changed everything. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, postmarked from Hollow Grove. The handwriting was unfamiliar, scrawled in a hurried, almost desperate script. There were only 2 sentences. "Come back, you need to know the truth." It was unsigned. Despite herself, Anna felt compelled to return. There were too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in her memory. The night of the accident was a blur, a haze of flashing lights, screaming voices, and the smell of burning rubber. She remembered nothing of what led up to the crash, only waking up in the hospital days later, alone and orphaned. She never found out what caused the accident or why her parents had taken that road in the first place. Now perhaps she would finally get some answers. The trees began to thin as the car crested a small hill, revealing a large clearing ahead. At its center stood a grand but weathered mansion, its stone walls draped in ivy, windows dark and lifeless. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. This was her childhood home, though she barely recognized it now. The years had not been kind. Anna parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air was thick with the scent of a damp earth and decay. As she approached the front door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze.
"Hello?"
she called, her voice echoing through the empty hallways. No response. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit with only a few stray beams of light seeping through the dust-caked windows. The once grand foyer was in ruins, furniture covered in white sheets, walls lined with peeling wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust coating every surface. Anna's heart raced as she moved further into the house, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath her feet. She felt as if she were trespassing in a place that had been abandoned by time itself. Yet despite the disrepair, there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from upstairs, shattering the silence. Anna froze, her breath caught in her throat. Someone else was there. Anna's pulse quickened as she stared up the grand staircase, the source of the sound. It spiraled into the darkness above, where shadows seemed to twist and dance in the dim light. She hesitated, instinctively wanting to flee, but something rooted her in place. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps a deep-seated need to confront whatever it was that lurked in the darkness. Gathering her courage, Anna began to ascend the stairs. Each step groaned under her weight, the wood dry and brittle from years of neglect. She could feel the eyes of the house on her, as though it was watching her every move, breathing in her fear. Halfway up, the temperature dropped abruptly, the air turning frigid. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed doors. The silence was oppressive, thick enough to choke on. Anna paused, straining her ears for any sound, any hint of movement, but all she had heard was the frantic pounding of her own heart. A door creaked open at the end of the far end of the hall, its hinges wailing in protest. Anna's stomach twisted into knots as she forced herself to move forward toward it, her legs heavy with dread. The door led to her parents' old bedroom, a place she hadn't dared to enter since their deaths. As she approached, she noticed something peculiar. The door wasn't just open, it had been forced to open. The door splintered around the latch. Someone or something had broken in. She pushed the door open with trembling hands, revealing the room beyond. It was exactly as she remembered it, frozen in time. The massive four-posted bed still dominated the room, its velvet curtains drawn shut. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the weak sunlight filtering through the curtains. The room was eerily untouched, as if waiting for its occupants to return. But something was wrong. The bed was rumpled, the sheets tangled and strewn across the floor, as though someone had fled from it in a hurry. And there on the nightstand was a photo album. It hadn't been there before, Anna was sure of it. With a shaking hand, she picked up the album. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn. She flipped it open, revealing pages filled with photographs of her family. There was her mother, smiling warmly, her father looking proud and strong, and herself, a little girl with bright eyes and a wide grin. But as she turned the pages, the pictures grew darker, the faces twisted into expressions of fear and anguish. The final photo stopped her cold. It was of the crash, the mangled wreckage of the car, her parents' lifeless bodies, and a shadowy figure standing over them, watching. Anna dropped the album, her breath coming in shallow gasps. How could this be possible? These photos, this album, shouldn't exist. She had never seen these images before, yet there they were, as real as the ground beneath her feet. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted further, and Anna felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but the room was empty. Panic surged through her veins. She wasn't alone. Something was there with her. Something that had been waiting for her to return. Anna's breath came in rapid, shallow bursts as she backed away from the nightstand, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to pulse with life of their own, twisting and wreathing as if they were alive. The sense of being watched intensified, making her skin crawl. Then a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable.
Anna.
The voice was faint, as though carried by a gust of wind. It was neither male nor female, yet it held an unsettling familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. She froze, her eyes wide with terror as she strained to hear it again.
Anna, you shouldn't have come back.
The voice echoed through the room, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her, closing in on her. Anna clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew louder.
You need to leave before it's too late.
No!
Anna screamed, with sound reverberating off the walls.
Who are you? What do you want?
Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Then the voice returned, but this time it was different, darker, more sinister.
You know who I am. You've always known.
A shadow moved in the corner of the room, a shape barely visible in the dim light. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she watched it slither across the floor, creeping closer and closer. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, as the shadow took form. A tall, gaunt figure cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. Anna stumbled backwards, her legs trembling in fear.
What do you want from me?
The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, its head tilting slightly to one side as if studying her.
The truth,
it hissed, the voice like a blade slicing through the air.
You buried it deep, but it's always been there, festering, waiting to be unleashed.
Anna shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face.
No, I don't understand. What truth?
The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating.
The truth about the accident and what really happened that night.
Anna's mind raced, her memories a chaotic jumble of images and emotions. The crash, the fire, the screams. She had tried to forget, tried to move on, but the past wouldn't let her go. The memories were fractured, incomplete, but now they were starting to resurface, piecing themselves together like a puzzle. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and bony, pointing at her.
You caused the crash, Anna. You're the reason they're dead.
The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs.
No, that's not true. I was just a child. I couldn't have.
But the memories were coming back now, flooding her mind with images she had long suppressed. The argument in the car, her parents' raised voices, her own childish screams and frustration and danger. She had been throwing a tantrum, demanding that they turn around and go back home. She didn't want to go to Hollow Grove that night. She hated the place, hated the dark woods that seemed to close in on them. In her fit of rage, she had grabbed the steering wheel, yanking it to the side. The car swerved violently, veering off the road and tumbling down the steep embankment. Her mother's scream echoed in her ears, followed by the sickening crunch of metal and glass, and then darkness. Anna staggered backward, clutching her head as the memories crashed over her.
No, it wasn't my fault. It couldn't have been.
But deep down, she knew the truth. She had buried it for years, locking it away in the furthest corners of her mind, too ashamed and horrified to face it. She had blamed the accident on everything else, bad weather, a faulty car, even the treacherous road itself, but never on what it really was, her own actions. The shadowy figure seemed to grow taller, its form more solid, as if feeding on her realization.
You killed them, Anna. You took their lives with your own hands.
Anna sank to her knees, the weight of the revelation crushing her. Tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper.
I didn't mean to. I didn't know.
The figure loomed over her, its presence overwhelming.
But you did, and you've been running from it ever since.
Anna's breath hitched as the truth of those words settled into her bones. She had spent her entire life running, away from Hollow Grove, away from her past, away from herself. But no matter how far she ran, the guilt had always been there, lurking in the shadows of her mind, festering like an open wound. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in as the figure drew nearer. It knelt before her, its face still obscured, but she could feel its cold breath on her skin.
You can't run anymore, Anna. It's time to face what you've done.
She looked up at the figure, her vision blurred by tears.
What do you want from me? How can I make it right?
The figure was silent for a moment, as if contemplating her question. Then it leaned in closer, its voice a low, rasping whisper.
The truth is a heavy burden, but it's yours to bear. You can't change the past, but you can atone for it. You must confront the darkness within yourself.
Anna's heart pounded in her chest as the figure's words sank in. Atonement? How could she possibly atone for something so horrific? But as she looked into the figure's shrouded face, she realized that it wasn't about atonement, it was about acceptance. She had to accept what she had done, no matter how painful, if she ever wanted to be free of the guilt that had consumed her for so long. With trembling hands, she reached out toward the figure, her fingers brushing against its cold, insubstantial form.
I'm sorry.
She whispered, her voice breaking.
I'm so sorry.
The figure seemed to waver, its edges blurring as though it were dissolving into the darkness.
It's not me you need to apologize to.
It murmured.
It's yourself.
As the figure dissolved into the surrounding shadows, the room was left in a heavy, oppressive silence. The air was thick, as though it had been absorbed by the weight of Anna's confession, leaving her to suffocate in her own despair. The walls seemed closer now, the room shrinking around her as her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps.
Confront the darkness.
The figure's parting words echoed in her mind, looping over and over until it was all she could hear. But what did it mean? How could she confront something that was so deeply ingrained in her, something that had become part of her very being? As she sat in the suffocating quiet, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway, from the same direction she had heard the crash earlier. Slowly, Anna stood, her legs trembling as though they could barely hold her weight. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Anna forced herself to move toward the door, each step feeling like it might be her last. She had come here seeking answers, but now that she was on the brink of uncovering the truth, she wasn't sure She could handle it. The tapping grew louder as she neared the hallway, becoming almost deafening by the time she reached the door. Her hand shook as she grasped the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock through her system. She hesitated for a moment, gathering what little courage she had left, before turning the knob and pushing the door open. The hallway was darker than before, the shadows thicker, almost solid. The tapping had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Anna stepped into the hall, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She felt as though she were walking through a tunnel, the walls closing in on either side, the darkness swallowing her whole. As she moved further down the hall, she noticed a door at the very end, slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from the crack, casting an eerie glow on the floor. The tapping resumed, coming from behind the door this time, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. Anna reached the door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The room beyond was bathed in a sickly yellow light, the source of which was a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting a different version of herself, some younger, some older, but all with the same haunted expression. In the center of the room was a figure, seated in a wooden chair with its back to her. It was small, childlike, and Anna's breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. It was her, herself as a child. The version of her that had died along with her parents on that fateful night. The child was tapping its foot against the floor, the sound echoing around the room. Slowly it turned its head to look at her, its eyes wide and hollow, filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch into eternity.
You left me.
The child said, its voice a hollow echo of Anna's own.
You left me here, all alone.
Anna's heart broke as she looked into the child's eyes, seeing all the pain and fear she had buried for so long.
I'm sorry.
She whispered, her voice trembling.
I didn't know. I didn't understand.
The child stood up from the chair, its movement slow and deliberate, as though it were weighed down by the years of neglect and abandonment.
You left me to carry it all.
Its voice cracking with emotion.
All the pain, all the guilt. You left it all on me.
Tears streamed down Anna's face as she took a step toward the child.
I'm sorry.
She repeated, her voice choked with sobs.
I was afraid. I didn't want to face it.
The child shook its head, its expression sorrowful.
It's too late.
It said, its voice fading into a whisper.
It's too late for sorry.
The child's words echoed throughout the room, reverberating off the mirrors that lined the walls. It's too late, they seemed to say over and over, growing louder until they were a deafening roar in Anna's mind. She clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was of no use. The words were inside her, lodged deep in her consciousness, where she could never escape them. As she stood there, trembling and helpless, the mirrors around her began to change. The reflections shifted, twisting and warping, until they were no longer showed her at all. Instead, they depicted scenes from her past, moments she had forgotten or tried to forget. The arguments between her parents, the nights she spent alone in her room, terrified of the dark and things that lurked within it. And then the accident, the image of the car spinning out of control, the headlights flashing through the trees as it careened off the road. The scene played out in each mirror over and over from different angles, each one showing a new piece of the puzzle. The screams, the terror, the moment of impact, every detail was laid bare before her, forcing her to relive it all. But this time there was something new, something she had never seen before. In the chaos of the crash, in the seconds before the car went over the edge, she saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road watching. A figure cloaked in a shadow, its face hidden, but its presence unmistakable. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure in the mirrors, her mind racing. Had it always been there? Had she somehow blocked it out, unable to cope with the horror of what she had seen? Or was it something else, something she had created in her mind, a manifestation of her guilt and fear? The figure seemed to move closer, stepping out of the mirrors and into the room with her. Anna turned to face it, her heart pounding in her chest. The child was gone, the room empty except for her and the figure. It stood before her, its presence oppressive and terrifying. Anna could feel the weight of its gaze, even though its face was hidden in darkness. The air around her grew cold, the chill seeping into her bones as she stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The figure reached out a hand, skeletal and cold, and pointed directly at her.
You know who I am.
It whispered, its voice a low, rasping echo that filled the room.
I am the truth that you've tried to hide. I am the darkness within you, the guilt you've buried for so long.
Anna shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
No, please no.
She pleaded, her voice trembling.
I didn't mean to, I was just a child.
The figure took a step closer, its form looming over her, dark and imposing.
You were the catalyst.
It said, its voice unyielding.
Your actions set everything in motion. You spent your life running from the truth, but you can't escape it. It's time to face what you've done.
Anna collapsed to her knees, her body racked with sobs. The weight of her guilt, her fear, her shame, all of it crashed down on her, crushing her beneath its unbearable load. She'd been running for so long, trying to convince herself that she was innocent, that she wasn't to blame, but deep down she had always known the truth.
I'm sorry.
She whispered, her voice barely audible.
I'm so sorry.
The figure stood over her, silent and still, as if waiting for her to fully understand the gravity of her confession. The room around them seemed to fade away, the mirrors dimming until they reflected only darkness. There was nothing left but her, the figure, and the truth that she could no longer deny. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly, the figure began to dissolve, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke that swirled around her. The darkness receded and the room began to take shape again, though it was no longer the haunted mansion of her childhood. Instead, she found herself standing in a small, nondescript hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. She looked around, confused and disoriented. The room was bare except for a single bed in the center, and in that bed lay an old woman, frail, withered, her breathing shallow and labored. It took Anna a moment to recognize her, but when she did, a shock of recognition ran through her. It was her mother. But how? Her mother had died in the crash. This couldn't be real, could it? Anna approached the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she could see that the old woman's eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling with a vacant expression.
Mom!
Anna whispered, her voice trembling.
Is it really you?
The old woman's eyes flickered, and slowly, painfully, she turned her head to look at Anna. There was a moment of silence, then a weak, rasping voice escaped her lips.
Anna, you came back.
Anna's breath caught in her throat as she reached out to take her mother's hand.
I'm so sorry, Mom.
She whispered, tears streaming down her face.
I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen.
Her mother's grip was weak, but she squeezed Anna's hand gently.
It wasn't your fault, Anna.
She whispered, her voice barely audible.
It was never your fault. We were already lost long before that night.
Anna shook her head, the weight of her guilt still heavy on her shoulders.
But I caused the accident.
You were just a child.
Her mother interrupted, her voice firmer now, though still weak.
We should have protected you. We failed you. But you must forgive yourself, Anna. You have to let go.
Anna sobbed, her heart breaking all over again as she realized the truth of her mother's words. She'd been holding on to the guilt for so long, allowing it to consume her, to define her. But now, in this moment, she understood she had to forgive herself. It was the only way to be free. With a deep, shuddering breath, Anna nodded.
I'll try.
She whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
I'll try to let go.
Her mother smiled weakly, her eyes closing as if the effort of speaking had exhausted her.
Goodbye, Anna.
She murmured, her voice fading.
Be at peace.
Anna watched as her mother's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. The room grew silent, and for a moment Anna was filled with a profound sense of loss. But as she stood there holding her mother's hand, a strange calm washed over her, replacing the fear and guilt that had plagued her for so long. She didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually the room around her began to dissolve, fading into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, She was back in the mansion, standing in the same room where the mirrors had shown her the truth. But the mirrors were gone, and the room was empty, bathed in a soft golden light that filtered through the windows. The oppressive darkness that had haunted her was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that she had never known before. Anna took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her guilt finally lift from her shoulders. She knew she would never forget what had happened, never forget the pain she had caused or the lives that had been lost. But she knew that she couldn't let it define her any longer. With a final glance around the room, Anna turned and walked towards the door. As she stepped out into the hallway, the light followed her, illuminating her path. And for the first time in 20 years, Anna felt free. She left Hollow Grove behind her, the echoes of the past fading into the distance as she drove away. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Anna knew that she could face whatever came next. She'd confronted the darkness within herself, and she had survived. And now it was time to live.